There is a particular hush that settles over a road at night when the radio is a low ember and the world outside the windshield has softened into shadow. Picture that hush stretching into a canyon of stone and myth, where every echo is an edict and every footstep becomes a question. This is where our story begins, not with a thunderclap, but with a low, persistent hum, the kind of vibration that seems to come from the bones beneath your feet. It is the sound of crossing, of a line being walked, and of ancient doors groaning back open to let the living peer into the realm of the dead. That quiet road and its strange hum pulled you in. Subscribe and tell us in the comments what gives you more chills, the idea of doors opening to the dead or the feeling of crossing into the unknown. When we speak of the Greek underworld, we summon names that live like slow-burning coal in human memory. Hades, the quiet ruler who wears the look of a man who has read every sorrow. Persephone, who moves between seasons and secrets. Charon, whose frog-like urgency counts souls as if tallying coins. These figures are not relics on a museum shelf, but actors on a stage whose plays have been rewritten by time and by the anxieties of new generations. Into this theater stride figures of another kind, heroes born of capes and laboratories, of accidents and vows, of ideologies that glitter like city lights. They are the intruders and the invaders, the ones who have fought gods and aliens, and now they descend to what the ancients called Hades for reasons that are human and stubbornly personal. Imagine a modern hero crossing the barrier that the ancients put between day and night. There is usually a reason, a loved one stolen by fate, a debt that must be paid, or a wrong requiring an impossible right. The journey begins with wind at your back or a whisper in your ear, with shoes that hit the marble and a quick, contemptuous glance at a stone stele carved in a language that still remembers the bent grammar of mourning. The descent is a ritual, and even the most technologically augmented of champions must step into that ritual with the humility of a supplicant or the arrogance of a man certain that his chestplate will ward him from all harm. But the underworld does not care for machines or mandates. It eats the certainty of the living like light eats shadow at dawn. The first thing a modern hero learns is that power is translational, not absolute. A punch that shatters metal proves less useful against a realm that folds meanings like origami. In the hush between one heartbeat and the next, stratified realities exchange favors, and even the brightest suits and keenest vibranium do not translate into immunity from the slow, inexorable corrosion that dwells in Hades' shadow. And then there is the infection, a word that in our time has acquired a clinical, white-walled terror. In the underworld, it takes on a different shape, a metaphysical unsettlement that is not merely biological but ontological. It is the sense that names are unmoored, that once you are unmade from the person you insisted you were, and reconstituted around a hunger that is both literal and symbolic. Heroes arrive with purpose and leave with absence, trailing the echo of what they used to do like a discarded banner. This is where the old myths begin to twist into something new. The Greeks always worried about the erosion of identity in the face of death. They named it, they wrote hymns to it, and they imagined rivers that would wash memory from the mind. Today, when a hero is bitten or tainted, the narrative folds in the modern fear of contagion and the ancient fear of forgetting, producing a creature that is at once recognizable and terrifying. These are not mindless monsters in the simplistic sense. They are the byproduct of heroic passion refined into hunger, of valor stripped of its purpose and sharpened into predation. Consider the image, a caped figure whose emblem once inspired millions now slouches through an underworld avenue where columns drip like stalactites of blackened wax. The cape is ragged, the emblem is a ghostly smear, and the stride has become an odd, hesitant cadence, as if the body remembers the dances it once performed in battle. Around that figure coil the shades of the underworld, not merely the dead but the dead as they wish they had been, the might-have-beens and the never-weres. They are silent critics and eager companions, and they watch the corrupted hero with a hunger that is both predatory and profoundly political. When these beings encounter classical guardians, a bemused Charon, a knowing Hecate at a crossroads, a Persephone who carries the memory of spring in the hem of her cloak, strange negotiations occur. Charon might refuse his fare the way a city toll-taker refuses counterfeit coins, and Hecate may offer a torch that illuminates what remains of a hero's conscience. Persephone, who has traded months for motion, becomes a figure who can see both the living and the dead with a tenderness that hurts. She understands what it means to be divided, to have one foot in the Tylanglo world and another in the grave's quiet earth. These gods are not always cruel. They are often blunt, and their bluntness is a kind of mercy. When a hero arrives seeking to drag back a lost friend from the grips of this hunger, the underworld does not let myth be sentimental. It insists on terms. Souls that are consumed change the recipe of the realms. They become both lesson and warning, mirror and mirrors fold. A bargain may be struck, but bargains in the underworld are never free of irony, and every rescue exacts a cost that echoes through the bones of the living city above. It is tempting to describe the infection in purely medical terms: virus, bite, transformation. Yet the Greek vision insists that illnesses are stories. They are narratives that rewrite a person's place in the cosmos, and the underworld is where these rewritten books are shelved. The hero who returns infected carries chapters that cannot be unstitched. His or her voice will fit into new cadences. Their instincts will contract and expand like lungs learning a new language. Companions notice the small changes first: a laugh that falls flat, eyes that linger on movement rather than faces, a sudden appetite for what tastes like eternity. As the tale unfolds, there are scenes that mirror each other in unnerving symmetry: a battle beneath a collapsed temple, a negotiation at the edge of Styx where ferrymen who once took coins now scratch icons into driftwood, a labyrinthine field where shades reenact their last days with a cruel fidelity. These tableaux speak to the way myth and modernity echo, how a broken gauntlet on a statue recalls the image of a smashed idol on a city street. They remind the listener that what is new is merely another arrangement of the old fears: fear of loss, fear of perversion, fear that what was noble can become grotesque. Yet horror in the underworld is not purely negative, it has its own strange beauty. There are moments of clarity in the corrupted, and those moments are devastating. When a former hero pauses, placing a hand on the broken marble of a tomb for a second so long it feels like an apology, the listener can feel the shards of identity trying, vainly, to reassemble. The ravaged face might hold a memory of a child's laugh, and for a heartbeat the monster and the man are the same, and then the hunger draws them apart like tide pulling a shell from sand. Heroes, even when transformed, are not devoid of the traits that made them heroic. They possess stamina, strategic acumen, stubborn moral reflexes that surface oddly in their new state. A corrupted fighter might still protect a small cluster of pathetic survivors from worse things because, in the calculus of their new existence, defense becomes a method of prolongation. This creates complicated moral landscapes for those who must decide whether to fight or save, to slay or to salvage, to honor the soul they once knew or to end its damned persistence. The underworld stages these dilemmas with an exactness that humiliates ordinary ethics. The dead argue with the living, not in sound but in the way their presence asks uncomfortable questions. What is duty when the person you loved is now a danger to others? Is mercy denial, or is killing a favor? The ancient poets liked to let such questions hang in the air like wine fumes. In our story they hang like the smell of iron and salt and the quiet decay of long-buried things. There is an element of courtroom drama to many of these encounters. Hades' court does not require a prosecutor or a jury in the modern sense, yet every slayer and supplicant feels judged. The gods listen with a boredom that reads as wisdom, and they render pronouncements that are sometimes kind and often fatal. Their decrees are reminders that nothing truly belongs to the living, that mortality is not merely a biological fact but a sovereign claim. When a hero demands that a loved one be returned, the answer is never straightforward. The underworld's ledger is full of crossed-out names and penciled amendments. One of the more harrowing images is the banquet hall of the dead, where shades assemble around a table that remembers seasons like rings on a tree. There are seats for tyrants and poets alike, elbows rubbing, memories exchanging half-truths, and somewhere in that long, diamond dining room a corrupted champion sits with the appetite of a winter sea. Food in that place tastes like stories, and each mouthful is a swallowing of histories. The grotesque center of it all is that banquet redeems and damns at once. It feeds the body in a way that starves the soul. The contagions mechanics in myth are never tidy because metaphor resists tidy maps. Often it behaves like a memory that takes physical form, pulling an excess of life into a single aimless hunger. At other times it resembles a curse laid down by a jealous god or a misfired spell, a divine graffiti sprayed along the bones of the valley. This unpredictability keeps heroes and listeners alike vigilant. The underworld refuses to be reduced to an algorithm. As the narrative deepens, the listener begins to perceive patterns in the chaos. There are certain types of resistance that persist: compassion exhaustion when companions repeatedly try to save the unsavable, rituals attempted out of a hope that ancient songs can weave back a thread of humanity, and at times a bureaucratic insistence from the gods that spells bind as tightly as contracts. These patterns are the scaffolding through which desperate people attempt to rebuild order amidst the unmaking. They are also the birthplace of new myths, and myths, once uttered, congeal quickly into hard fact for those who believe. The underworld is also a place of mirrors. It shows heroes not as they were but as they could be understood across ages. A modern hero's hubris, the insistence that technology or superior will make one immune, is reflected in a mirror that mocks such arrogance. That reflection is a tool the underworld uses, softer than a blade but sharper than regret. It compels introspection by revealing 1,000 versions of failure and 1,000 ways to be forgiven that are conditional and costly. A long stretch of the story is given over to alliances that seem unlikely on the surface. Disparate survivors, a demigod who remembers the taste of ambrosia, a scientist whose instruments cannot detect the metaphysical, a thief who knows secret doors, find themselves forming fragile covenants. These alliances are not charismatic, they are pragmatic, bristling with mistrust and punctuated by accommodations made under duress. Yet in their awkwardness there is a human music, the instinct to band together, to invent small rituals to stave off despair, to exchange stories that are both bartered commodities and defiant acts of memory preservation. Conflict inevitably escalates. The underworld, being a theater of extremes, does not conserve its energies in ambiguous skirmishes. Battles erupt in settings that are themselves characters, the rusted belly of a sunken temple, a colonnade whose pillars hum with the first languages, a ruined amphitheater where the applause has been replaced by a chorus of lost names. Combat there is thick with symbolism. A blow that shatters a statue head is perhaps more devastating than one that ends a life because statues are memory made stone. And yet, within tragedy, the narrative often locates moments of near-sacred clarity. A hero who has resisted the hunger may choose to let themselves be taken if it means allowing others to escape. Or conversely, a corrupted champion, for a flicker of reason, may guide the living through a particularly lethal maze because the memory of their oath remains lodged in them like a splinter. These instances are small lumens of meaning lighting a cavernous gloom, and the listener feels them as a cold and sudden kindness. The gods, observant and occasionally meddlesome, sometimes provide riddles rather than resolutions. Hecate's crossroads offer choices but conceal costs, and often the path that seems most merciful leads to unforeseen consequence. Persephone's compromises between spring and winter become parables for those trying to live between states, alive and dead, remembered and forgotten, human and other. The cosmic negotiation is never tidy because the currency is not mere goods but identity and memory and the often ambiguous notion of what it means to live rightly. An evocation of the river Styx is unavoidable, for the river is a principle rather than a place, a border made of binding. To touch the Styx is to have an oath tattooed into your marrow. It is also the place where the living and the dead blur into a continuum. Heroes seek the Styx for its promise of release, for the chance to cross and thereby fix what was broken, but the river exacts a price. The listener imagines water that tastes like iron and old vows, a current that takes names and returns nothing but echoes. The interplay between modern technology and ancient rites creates striking tableau. Imagine, for a breath, a lab bench littered with beakers and a stela with carved supplications leaning against a centrifuge. Scientists with gloved hands attempt to quantify metaphysics and find their instruments make only artful noises. Their equations collapse in the face of phenomena that refuse to be linear, and their protocols become prayers. The collision of these idioms, lab coat and laurel wreath, is not simply comedic. It unearths a mutual insufficiency and, sometimes, an uneasy complementarity. Language itself changes in the underworld. Words mutate like the creatures that wander its avenues. A battle cry that once meant justice becomes a guttural noise that is more call than concept. An oath that used to invoke lineage becomes a string of syllables that steady hands cannot reproduce. This erosion and reformation of speech is part of the broader theme. The underworld consumes and recasts the forms by which societies articulate meaning. For listeners engaged in the tale, these sonic shifts underline the fragility of cultural anchors. There are long stretches where the narrative becomes a ledger of losses, but losses are not simply negative entries. Each bereavement is an opportunity for story-making. Survivors tell tales of the ones they lost, embellishing for comfort, trimming details for a rhythm that helps the mouth carry the hurt. These narratives circulate like contraband wrapped in cloth. They become a way to keep the dead from sinking entirely into the mud of forgetfulness. In that act of retelling, the community becomes a living archive, and even corrupted heroes find themselves asymptotically approaching redemption through the eyes of storytellers. The atmosphere of the underworld is painted with sensory detail that is uncanny because it crossbreeds the familiar with the impossible. Imagine smelling bread baking in a house that no longer has a roof, hearing a child's laughter inside a tomb, feeling summer warmth in a cavern that consumes light. These dislocations are the underworld's devices for unsettling the listener's assumptions about where comfort and danger reside. They make the moral calculations of the characters feel urgent and real, because we recognize our own homes in these perverse simulacra. At the center of the tale are decisions made under impossible constraints. A leader of the survivors may order a desperate strike that takes a life but saves many, and the cost is collated like grief into the ledger of the soul. The narrative lingers on these moments because they reveal character in the space where ideology gives way to improvisation. It reminds the listener that heroism sometimes looks a lot like a dirty choice made with clear eyes, and villainy sometimes appears as an accidental consequence of good intentions. The consequences ripple upward to the world above, changing politics and economies and the very texture of public ritual. Councils convene in marble halls to debate what to do when a pantheon has become porous to a new kind of pestilence. Priests and scientists argue, pamphlets circulate, survivors return with stories that read like fever dreams. The civic imagination strain as the populace tries to reconcile the image of a once invincible champion with the sobering sight of that same figure reduced to hunting in the dark. This response is part of the wider social fabric that the underworld tests ruthlessly. Societies are measured by what they do when their icons fall. Some build shrines and rewrite histories to keep shame at bay, while others use the incident as fuel for purges and paranoia. The underworld becomes a mirror held up to power structures, exposing how fragile honor is when translated into policy. The hero's fall, then, becomes a civic symptom rather than merely a personal tragedy. In time, myth begins to accrete around the events, and new rituals form like barnacles on an ancient hull. People invent seasonal memorials, children chant names that are now warnings, poets craft odd odes to remind the living that vigilance requires ritual as much as law. These cultural artifacts have their own life. They proliferate and diverge, some becoming sacraments and others turning into superstitions that no one can fully name the origin of. Through these emergent practices, the society attempts to inoculate itself against repeating the same mistakes. For the corrupted heroes themselves, a spectrum of states unfolds. Some descend further into the hunger until their humanity is a rumor, others sustain a flicker of identity that they tend like a dying ember. There are tragic mini-arcs where a character chooses to be a beacon of chaos, believing that destruction is purity, and others where the corrupted work a kind of penance, using their altered forms to shield the living from worse abominations. These arcs create a tapestry rich in moral ambiguity and emotional complexity, keeping the listener invested not in clear-cut answers, but in a dense, human thrumming of motives and regrets. The story allows space for quiet, too, for silence is an instrument of revelation in this realm. In a moment of calm beneath a broken mosaic floor, a protagonist sits with a shade and shares an exchange of simple truths, the kind that only appear when the clamor ebbs. It is in these intervals of hush that the deepest changes register, the surrender of pride, the acceptance of loss, the forging of a new kind of courage that acknowledges limits. The listener recognizes that heroism in this place needs not only brawn but a large tenderness. As the narrative spirals onward, it refuses the finality of single climaxes. Instead, it offers layered resolutions, each one partial and provisional. A saved village is celebrated but marked by absence, a corrupted champion may be driven away but not cured, a treaty with the gods grants a hard-won reprieve that will need to be renegotiated. These fragmented endings mirror how actual lives are reconciled, rarely tidy, often patched, and always set within larger continuities of harm and repair. Near what feels like the story's end, there is an elegiac sequence in which the living build a memorial at the river's edge. Names are named aloud, skies listen. The memorial is a mixture of the ancient and the contemporary, wreaths are laid beside broken tech, and inscriptions blend epic meter with campaign slogans, the vernacular of memorials braided with that of advertising. The result is not ugly but honest, a testament to a culture attempting to stitch together identity from bits and broken dreams. But the Underworld's lessons do not stop at mourning. They seed future caution and courage. New guardians arise who are shaped by the crisis, who blend ritual with reason, who recognize that some infections require more than medicine, they require storywork, community tending, and the hard labor of ritual reconciliation. These guardians are not perfect, but they are careful, they understand that maintenance is the base form of heroism now. The world above learns to build bridges where there had been only arrogance and to keep watch with humility rather than with trumpets. In the quiet that follows, life persists in 1,000 little acts. A baker opens her shop, a child draws a sun beside a damaged statue, a runner treads the old road and mutters the names of the fallen like a litany. The underworld recedes into the fold of things remembered, but it never fully leaves. The boundary remains porous enough for awe and terror to slip through. The narrative ends not with an apocalypse, but with a knotted continuity, the kind that holds both beauty and dread in balanced measure. So the story circles back to the hush and the hum that started it all. The road is the same and changed, the radio hums, the city glows, and somewhere beneath it all the underworld keeps its slow watch. Heroes, corrupted and redeemed and all the shades between, continue to teach the living how to reckon with their own finitude. The price of entrance into that teaching is steep, but its lessons are as old as sorrow and as new as the next morning's headline. Night in the underworld is a different kind of night, one that knows the slow arithmetic of loss and remembers everything it has consumed. Hades moves through it like a sovereign through a city of law, footsteps measured on ash and shadow, each step inscribing authority in a place where authority is rarely disputed. Persephone follows not as a shadow but as a season, bringing with her the memory of sunlit fields and the cold clarity of winter. Together they tread the thin line between comfort and dread, the line that makes the dead turn toward meaning. The air around them tastes of iron and old rain, and somewhere far below, the Styx hums like a restless throat, waiting to speak and to swallow at once. There is an old rule in the dark: spirits remember the faces of those who rule them, and they remember the faces of those who were lost. Hades' face is carved of night and patience, and Persephone's is a map of returning, a record of rivers thawing. They are kin to silence, but not servants of it. Their arguments, when they happen, are quiet and terrible, small storms that rearrange entire cemeteries. Tonight the quiet has a crack in it, a new scent like metal and fever, and something else that does not belong to any memory sung by the dead. When the crack becomes a tear, light pours through it in a way that mortals might call unnatural. It is a light that is not warmth. It has the clinical precision of lab light and the jagged, hungry pulse of a broken neon sign. Figures spill through that light like spilled ink, tattered, ravenous, a parody of life in which every familiar human contour has been turned inside out by hunger. These are not the ordinary dead of the underworld, they are something else entirely, and every instinct Hades possesses warns him that this is not a problem to be handled with old treaties and patient calculation. Persephone watches them with an expression both unreadable and intensely alive. Where her motherly summer glows, there is also steel. She knows the earth, she knows rot, and she knows the sacred rule that all things must return in some order. They are not ours, she says simply, the words a bell in a chapel. Hades grounds himself on that certainty. For him, ownership is a proof against chaos, and the presence of these invaders erodes even the foundations of his confidence. Close observation reveals fragments of strange attire and artifacts clinging to these creatures, a torn logo here, a glint of something manufactured there, all foreign to the mud and vine of the underworld. Faces once familiar to an earth that tilts under different stars show through the decay in glimpses, faces that belong to a mythology of capes and heroes and a modern worship. But those faces are distorted, their eyes like burnt-out stars, their mouths foaming with an appetite that is not for memory but for flesh. The sight of such familiar guises and unimaginable ruin is a shock that is both aesthetic and ethical. Even in the underworld, placeholders of honor are not to be defiled without consequence. At first Hades considers protocols, send the Furies to unmake them, bar the portals, negotiate with whoever opened a rip between worlds. Protocol is textile and thread in his hands, but even thread will burn when made of wrong yarn. He senses a deeper warp, something aggressive that will not be sewn back into the quilt of acceptable fates. Persephone feels it too, a wrongness that hums against the bones of the world, and her command is not law but invitation: come. See. They walk among the invaders with the terrible calm of rulers who know how to be terrifying by simply not reacting. The living dead shift their attention as if alerted by some common puppeteer, heads turning like rusted clock hands to focus on the figures of authority. One of them lurches forward, dragging a cape that once must have been bright and symbolic, now smeared and shredded, a banner for an apocalypse of appetite. Hades looks at it without sentiment. Persephone steadies the hands, the fingers that still hold a relic of the living world, and a cold ache blooms in her chest that is not pity so much as knowledge of how fragile life's outer finery can be. It becomes clear over the hours that these invaders operate on a contagion geometry both biological and metaphysical. They bite in the bit and change, but there is more. Their very presence alters the thresholds between memory and hunger, knitting a thread between desire and decay. Shades begin to twitch in their grave sleep, whispers braid into the air like smoke signals. The underworld thrives on a balance one learns by counting the empty chairs at a family table. These creatures tip the balance toward an appetite that wants to consume even the stories of those who died honorably. Hades convenes council in a cavern where stalactites drip like the slow fall of a precise clock. The Furies arrive with their chains and their brimstone wills, never silent for long. Hermes brings words from the surface, rumor thread of a world that has been burning at the edges, where marquee heroes fell and rose again unmade. Even Zeus's name is a drumbeat among them, a reminder that Olympus is not indifferent to cross-realm contamination, though hubris may keep it distant for now. Persephone insists on testing the infection herself, because rulers of two worlds have always been those who take the first step into danger. She moves among the walking dead with the same softness she brought to the first crocus under snow, her fingers trailing across broken armor over the gaunt cheekbones of beings who once laughed light into the world. Touch, she knows, leaves signatures in places both material and invisible. The hunger in their bellies sings a note she has heard before, ancient and simple, but with a modern dissonance that tethers it to devices and symbols, a new chord the underworld was never meant to learn. The Marvel zombies, as later scholars will awkwardly name them in marginalia scrawled on the inside of old maps, are not a uniform mass. They come in echoes, some shambling and slow, others quick with a burst violence taught by combat training that lingers even after death. Their cognition is an elementary calculus of consumption: recognize, pursue, bite, repeat. But when confronted by a goddess whose life is as much about seeds and seasons as it is about roots and rock, their pattern stutters. A memory of heroic posture is enough to confuse them for a beat, as if a muscle remembers a movement that no longer has a purpose. Hades erects a perimeter of shadow, a literal and figurative Morton hedge that filters passage and reason. He draws symbols from the bedrock, ancient sigils of contract and return, and sets them around the rift like luminous fences. The fates are consulted in whispers that sound like rainfall. They weigh strings of potential futures with a dispassion that stuns the living into stillness. "We bind," Hades says, and his voice is less a command than a law stepping into the light, "but we do not exterminate without cause." Persephone counters with softer, more cunning interventions. Where Hades thinks in binds, she thinks in gardens. She takes the living soil of her remembered spring and mixes it with winter loam, planting not with seeds but with questions. She wonders whether hunger can be redirected, whether a taste for life can be replaced with a taste for something else, memory, perhaps, or a substitute so subtle that the devouring reflex will slow and look for nourishment elsewhere. Her experiments are met with skepticism by the old gods, but she has always been the kind of ruler who remakes the rules by living inside them. They try parley first, because even hunger deserves a hearing. Persephone moves forward, palms open in a gesture older than trees, and speaks not to their human selves but to a thread of being within them. She asks who made them like this. She asks what they hunger for beyond the reflex of flesh. Her words wrap like a gentle vine around the exposed parts of their ancient dignity, and for one terrible, beautiful beat a sliver of reason returns. A hand pauses over a human throat, the jaw falters, and a sound, a memory of laughter, skitters like a moth across the surface of the dark. But the pause is fleeting. The contagion is a grammar unto itself, and it is written in tropes of urgency and epigraphs of appetite. The Marvel zombies lurch back into the motion that defined them, and the small miracle of the pause becomes a cruel doll to be examined later. Hades realizes that negotiation will not be enough. He is a ruler whose duty is to maintain borders and the dignity of death, and he now understands that this violation is not merely a threat to order but a test of what the dead can and cannot withstand. The underworld is not a museum for those who lived. It is a city-state with laws, and laws must be enforced for the safety of all citizens, even souls that have learned to endure. So the battle is joined in ways both mundane and metaphysical. Cerberus rises from his dreaming like a mountain coughed up from the throat of the earth, the three heads snapping at the invaders with jaws that remember the taste of souls. The Furies sing their old songs, a chorus of accusation that burns through the skull like an administered truth. Shadowfolds, those little pockets of unlight Hades keeps for centuries, sprout and swallow, trapping the more aggressive of the undead in loops where time itself becomes a penalty box. Yet even with Cerberus and Brimstone, the fight reveals a new variable. The Marvel zombies are not merely dead consumers, they bring with them artifacts that leak power. An armored glove sparks with a cold lightning that eats at shadow, causing whole patches of Hades' wards to writhe and unravel. A sigil from a superhero's chest acts like a beacon, rewriting the logic of the underworld in a pinch of salt and circuitry. Gods as old as the stones find themselves puzzled by technology that behaves like a magic they vaguely remember reading about in the fever dreams of certain mortals. Persephone notices how certain invaders are drawn not to flesh alone but to ideas. The beat of a prayer, the thumpet of a story, those human things attract them like light attracts moths. Where an old soldier's relic is gnawed, the relic story begins to leak out into the world, and something like a memory streams back through the wound. Persephone collects those stories like seeds, tucking them in her cloak, because she knows that history can be a bomb if it is fed back kindly. Even the Marvel zombies, she thinks, might be more recoverable if the culture they were born into can be woven into the soil in a new language. Hades, for all his severity, has a quiet curiosity. He sends emissaries into the rift to gather items that hum with the wrong electricity, to study them in the laboratories of the dead where inventors who never lived dream of gears. They return with objects that smell of supermarket lights and steel, bluish and humming, objects that war against divinity by promising a different kind of immortality, viral fame, endless cycles of spectacle. The gods look upon them as if they are looking at a contagion of the soul itself, something that reprograms memory into trending patterns. The contagion can be visualized as two competing viruses, the biological spread of undead flesh, and a mimetic contagion that rewrites how stories are told. The latter is particularly infuriating to the gods, because gods are essentially stories multiplied. If stories change, gods change. Hades considers himself a custodian of the cycle, not its author, and yet here are new authors writing in a hand he does not know. He feels the edge of something he has never needed to feel, irrelevance. That fear makes him more dangerous, slow and methodical and sharp. On the human surface, there are echoes of these phenomena. Mortals whisper of undead heroes returning in cities that used to be bright with billboard gods. Social media, a strange thing that Persephone studies like an anthropology student of the living, amplifies these echoes, birthing a second contagion, attention. The living crowd puts themselves on display, cameras whirring, and the undead learn to use attention as fuel. They adapt quickly, learning to turn spectacle into lure, and what started as a garden of the dead becomes a theater of predators. Back in the underworld, the dead are furious in a way no one expected. They are not passive in their graves, some stir and rise to voice terrible complaints. Ancestors who are supposed to be placid petition for closure and for protection. They want the bones of their kin left in peace and for the old rites to be respected. The presence of cinematic revenants, dressed in the attire of a different world's pop idols, feels like sacrilege, like the desecration of a shrine by a parade of clowns with poisoned hands. The fates intervene, issuing edicts that echo like the tolling of ancient bells. No crossing of realms for the sustenance of undeath, reads one decree, and it is signed in ink made from dried shadow. But decrees are lines drawn on paper without flesh. They are only as strong as the belief that holds them. Hades knows this. He also knows that if belief crumbles, then the very architecture of the underworld is at risk of being unstitched stitch by stitch. So he plans not merely to fight but to fortify belief. Persephone works differently. She turns the problem sideways and sends whispers back to the living world, disguised as winds that rustle the leaves of city parks and small miracles that appear in the margins of humans' days. She leaks the faintest memory of spring into the collective unconscious, an uptick in the color of flowers photographed in once muted alleyways, a surge in small acts of generosity that ripple like coins dropped into a fountain. It is subtle, a salve in an age of sensationalism, but slow cultivation is her art. If she can change enough hearts on the surface, she might blunt the supply line that feeds the hungry dead with attention and narrative oxygen. But the surface is faster than any goddess can be. The Marvel zombies learn and adapt with a pace that is terrifying. They start to mimic rituals, dressing in brazen parodies of funerary rites to confuse the less disciplined dead, who are drawn to ritual like moths. They spread false images that become true because so many believe them. Their costumes become icons, and icons demand devotion. The underworld finds itself wrestling not only with bodies but with a culture war happening across a sky it cannot touch. A new weapon is proposed, something neither Hades nor Persephone are entirely comfortable with: language as containment. Hermes, who traffics in words and thresholds, suggests turning the narratives the undead use to feed themselves against them. If the gods can find a way to rebuke the stories, to starve the lore that props the zombies up, perhaps the hunger will lose direction. But words can be dangerous when they are wielded as weapons. A miscast phrase could reshape the dead's existence in unforeseen ways. Even the fates caution patience. Strings of living and dead interweave in complicated patterns, and tugging at one can snap another. They try it anyway. The gods knit new myths into the edges of the old, myths that frame the hungry as tragic, not heroic, that return stolen glory to true histories instead of letting it be claimed by monsters. They quiet celebrity cults and elevate small acts of courage back onto pedestals. In the underworld, this takes on a physicality. Plaques in the halls rewrite themselves, murals heal, and statues finally learn to look the way their honorees ought to have looked. The change is not immediate, but it is a positive accretion of weight on the scale of influence. And yet, for every bar they lift, the zombies find another lever. They begin to exploit contradictions and resentments among the living, seeding doubt and bitterness with clinical precision, as if some new intelligence now drives their hunger. An argument on a street corner becomes a contagion of grief that the undead can feed on. A televised tragedy becomes a banquet that ripples into the underworld like a tsunami. Hades sits in his throne and feels the tilt of influence as if it were a physical tilt to one side of a weight he holds between his palms. He knows he must act and not merely react. The gods convene again, and this time the meeting smells of urgency like rain before a storm. Athena considers strategies that resemble chess, careful moves that require sacrifice far down the line. Poseidon offers to flood certain corridors with brine and salt to make them inhospitable to infection. Demeter grieves and then grinds her teeth until the earth itself seems to understand the wrongness. Strategy, for them, is both divine and domestic. It involves both spear and seed. Persephone listens to each idea like a gardener hearing weather reports, sorting what can be planted from what must be burned away. They attempt to quarantine the rifts using a blend of archaic and modern metaphysics. Old contracts are rewritten and sealed with gestures that look like magic but function like diplomacy. Hades negotiates with shadow traders, minor deities who trade in lost causes, for the siphon stones that can dampen the mimetic satellite of a fame-driven hunger. But such stones are rare and costly. They demand payment in the currency of memory, and memories that are traded cannot be retrieved unchanged. This economy of memory becomes central to the war. Hades contemplates offering up a collection of histories he has been hoarding, names and deeds of minor heroes, forgotten lullabies, the last letters of those who died in quiet wars. He sets them in vaults where the living will never easily poke through, knowing that some of them must be used as bait to starve the undead of their cultural feed. Persephone, meanwhile, plants those same memories in the living world in disguised forms, a folk song hummed at a bus stop, a mural in a subway that hints at a long-vanished kindness. It is a transfer of wealth from vault to common ground, a redistribution that feels like mercy. In a world trying not to forget, every memory matters. Subscribe and tell us in the comments which moment moved you more, Hades hiding the past or Persephone keeping it alive. The moral architecture of such decisions is heavy. Some gods argue that using memories this way is theft from those who suffered, others say it is necessary triage. Even Hades' heart, which most assume to be implacable, feels the strain of moral calculus. He does what he has always done, he weighs costs and chooses those that preserve the greatest number. It is a cold calculus, maybe, but it spares more graves than it sacrifices, and sometimes the god of the dead must be practical where poets would be sentimental. As the struggle lengthens, odd alliances form. Heroes from the other reality, those who resist infection, arrive as anomalies, battle-scarred survivors who have not been fully consumed by their world's plague. They are lost and bewildered, and they carry with them knowledge of how this contagion begins and spreads. Hades offers them shelter not as a favor but as a resource. Knowledge transforms into strategy. They speak of a virus that is both virological and ideological, something that infects not just tissue but reputation. These survivors, ragged knights of a cinema-tinged age, teach the underworld to think in vectors. They point out that televised attention, the amplification of outrage and spectacle, acts as a multiplicative factor for the undead's reach. A celebrity bitten becomes an emissary, not only of disease but of a brand. The gods had thought of souls as quiet, private things. The invaders have turned them into commodities, traded and rebranded on a scale that terrifies even ancient minds used to worship and tribute. Persephone becomes fascinated by the idea of contagion as commerce. She decides to create a counter-economy, a market of small, human-scale narratives that cannot be monetized or mass-distributed. If the undead feed on fame and viral narratives, she will cultivate stories that resist virality by being intimately local and stubbornly kind. She seeds these stories like slow-acting compost, a refused bribe here, a returned lost item there, a neighbor who sits with a grieving person and refuses to let them be alone. The net effect is subtle but accumulative. Attention fractures into ribbons that cannot be easily bundled and sold. Hades develops a harsher instrument, the trial of echoes, a juridical mechanism where undead captives are confronted with the echo of their pre-infection selves. It is not a torture but a legal procedure steeped in metaphysical jurisprudence. The captive is seated with strings of memory played like music until something inside them answers, not with hunger, but with recognition. Some break in a way that is salvageable, some do not. For those who do not, the law allows for containment that is regrettably absolute. Hades prefers regret to chaos, and the decision weighs on him like a crown too tight and too cold. The Furies, usually instruments of punishment, begin to function as social workers, remaking their fury into a tool of rehabilitation. They learn to listen, to coax, to tell stories that resonate at frequencies the captive might remember. It is humiliating for them at first. They are brimstone and accusation, not therapists. But their passion, repurposed for care rather than mere censure, becomes unexpectedly effective. They discover that the human heart, even when sullied, often holds a key in an old, rusted lock. Hopes rise and fall in cycles. The gods' measures sometimes work, then fail, then partially succeed. It is a war of attrition that is fought in alleys and archives alike. The living world provides its own theaters of contest, community centers, artists' collectives, underground radio stations that broadcast counter-narratives. A new cultural infrastructure arises, grassroots and stubborn, designed not to repel but to absorb the hunger and dilute it. It is inelegant but human, and those are often the best kinds of armor. But then comes a night when the rift widens again, and the underworld feels a tremor like tectonic shame. From this rupture pour not only the shambling bodies but entire streams of corrupted light, images stitched together with the clarity of advertising and the urgency of emergencies. The undead come not alone but with a crowd of illusions, animated billboards that whisper lies, avatars that act as shepherds, celebrity specters that command attention without consuming food. The gods watch, incredulous, as even the architecture of persuasion is weaponized. In response, Persephone organizes a festival in the underworld, absurd and luminous, a mock spring where forgetfulness is honored and small kindnesses are made public and ridiculous. The festival is designed to confuse the undead, to saturate the cultural market with nuance and private affection that cannot be easily repurposed into fuel. The dead come because they have been invited and because they have long loved ritual. Even Cerberus sits with one head cocked, as if he understands the comedy in the air. For a while, the festival disorients the invaders and quiets the rift with laughter and small food offerings that are symbolic rather than edible. It is not enough. The Marvel zombies adapt by building cadres, mini societies that use stolen technology to coordinate their feeding. They establish nodes in the underworld where they experiment with turning grief into power. Hades watches as whole neighborhoods of the dead become compromised, their memories rewired to sing for something that never loved them back. He understands that containment alone will not suffice. The war requires infiltration and conceptual sabotage. This makes him less comfortable than any battle that involved spears and well-placed ambushes, because the enemy now occupies the language of intimacy. So Hades goes deeper. He descends into the oldest places of the underworld, into caverns so ancient even forgetfulness feels new, to consult beings that predate even the fates, the primordial whispers, the names that are not spoken at dinner tables. He asks them for old tricks, obscure rites of turning and reversal, incantations that make hunger look upon itself and see its reflection as emptiness. Those rituals are crude and dangerous. They require payment in something ineffable. Hades agrees, and the underworld trembles in the same way a patient flinches when a surgeon makes a necessary incision. The primordial rites require an offering of what the gods fear most, anonymity. Names must be surrendered, titles relinquished, statues toppled into memory. The world of heroes, celebrity, and branding must be stripped of logos and placed in anonymous boxes. The trade-off is bitter. To save the city of the dead, the gods must undermine the currency that drives modern fame. Persephone knows the cost intimately. She has spent her reign learning to let things go. She signs away signatures, and Hades signs away his careful, crystalline order to buy time for a world that is not his to save but is connected nonetheless. The consequence is a cultural inversion. Markets sputter where fame once grew rich, and in their place sprouts a more peculiar economy, one that values silence and intimate knowing. The living respond in strange ways. Some rage that their idols have been muted, while others breathe relief as the noise subsides. It is messy, ugly, full of human rebuttals against being controlled. Persephone watches it all with sympathy for the small, messy things that constitute life, and she finds herself smiling at the stubbornness of people who prefer difficulty to being told what to feel. The undead lose some vectors of power but gain others in desperation. They start to devour more than bodies. They ingest artifacts of technique, recordings, algorithms, and code, trying to substitute an abstract, data-driven immortality for the sensory flesh they cannot fully possess. This makes them both more dangerous and more fragile because they keep trying to wedge themselves into patterns that were never built for hunger. Hades' engineers, architects of the dead, respond by constructing odd fortifications, vaults built like music, frequencies that cancel certain types of data decay, walls that remember how to make sorrow feel meaningful rather than viral. As seasons turn, because even in the underworld there are cycles, in which Persephone brings her seasonal logic, the conflict evolves. Victory is not a scene of triumph but a long, exhausting negotiation in which humanity and divinity learn new respect for one another. The gods learn that modernity is not merely an insult to tradition, it is a new layer that must be integrated. The living discover that many of the answers they sought in media and celebrity were naive. They must return to smaller, more sustained forms of care. A particularly harrowing night arrives when an entire cohort of the once famous and now infected enact a mock coronation for one of their own, proclaiming a zombie deity of appetite. The act is theatrical and unnerving, and its cathartic power is real. For an hour they conduct mass rituals that funnel attention into a communal hunger strong enough to open fissures in the rift. Hades watches as the ground hums with this collective focus, and he understands that the only response must be equally communal and human scale. So Persephone organizes an act of living devotion, not a spectacle but a practice, a worldwide justice of reciprocity, small actions that ripple like footsteps in fresh snow. People begin to start neighborhood suppers, to look after elders, to protect stray animals, and to plant community gardens in empty lots. The movement is not coordinated by a single voice but by the slow accretion of many hands. It is dull and beautiful and stubbornly ineffective at producing viral headlines, and for that reason it works to starve the monster. Hades moves strategically, using ancient law to create barriers and Hermes to whisper warnings where needed, but much of the shifting tide is due to human stubbornness. The Marvel zombies thicken and lose their sheen because the supply of story fuel dries up, replaced by 1,000 little acts of unshareable love. It sounds improbable, but gods are, ultimately, about consequences, and consequences what perseverance creates. Persephone watches seedlings become gardens and thinks of the long summer she once denied herself so that new life could begin. Even victory is not total. Fragments of the infection remain, hardened like barnacles on the underworld's hull. The gods set up hospitals for the partially converted, places where slivers of identity can be carefully stitched back together. Some citizens cannot be recovered and are bound in quiet cells where they cannot harm others, kept alive by laws that feel as brutal as they are merciful. Hades presides over these decisions with a weight that makes his throne feel heavier, because every soul matters differently to those left wailing above ground and to those who have no more names. Over the long years, new legends are written about the episode. Mortals incorporate the story into their rituals, a night of free neighbors, a feast where little is demanded, a small prayer to the underworld that asks only for quiet. The gods do not mind these changes. Myth has always been a living creature that prefers new languages to stale adoration. Persephone's festival becomes a faint tradition, later called by some a weird, tender harvest of forgotten things, by others simply a good reason to share bread. The Marvel zombies become a cautionary tale outside of the underworld's memory as well. Writers and priests and small-time prophets retell the tale in the margins of their sermons, warning of the dangers of fame and the corrosive hunger of spectacle. Some turn it into moralizing art that simplifies the nuance into a black and white fable. Others, with less appetite for neatness, keep the Messier version alive, a tale about the necessary friction between modernity and tradition and the way love often wins not in a flash of lightning but in the stubbornness of neighbors. Years pass and the underworld settles into a new rhythm, a choreography of vigilance and domestic tenderness. Hades and Persephone, their union deepened by crisis, grow into a new kind of governance. They are rulers who know how to hold both the weight of endless night and the patience of spring. They have learned to treat culture as hard currency, to be careful with names, and to respect the small economies of attention that sustain life above ground. The Dark Kingdom is quieter now, not because it is empty but because it learned an old lesson: silence, used wisely, is as powerful as any spear. The survivors from the other reality, those who limped into the underworld and later decided to stay, become lorekeepers and artisans. They write their stories down in forms that can only be accessed by a handful of trustworthy hands, their narratives placed in caches that preserve truth without converting it into commodity. They become living warnings and living bridges, human signposts pointing both backwards to what was lost and forwards to a fragile piece rebuilt stone by careful stone. Persephone wanders the borders more often as time lengthens, not out of duty but out of curiosity. She watches the living with the same fascinated tenderness she gave to spring blossoms, and she delights in the absurdities they invent in response to catastrophe. People make altars out of broken smartphones, filling them with candles and mute offerings that the gods cannot monetize. There is humor among them, dark and resilient, and Persephone keeps laughing in private, the sound of it a small tide that brings the underworld closer to the taste of life. Hades returns less to his solitary throne and more often to the council chambers, where law is now a living conversation rather than a cold edict. He has grown less suspicious of the messy improvisation of mortals and more aware that his world prospers when the surface world prospers in ways that cannot be slated on a ledger. The balance he keeps now is less a scale than a weaving, threads of sorrow and joy interlaced into a fabric that is stronger because it is mixed. And yet the memory of the Marvel zombies never fully evaporates. It remains a blackened seam in both worlds, a reminder that innovation can become an infection if it is not tempered by care. Poets write about it, not to dramatize but to anchor the warning in something beautiful. They tell of a night when the underworld was nearly remade by the hunger of a culture that failed to feed itself with love, preferring spectacle over neighborliness. The tale folds itself into recipes and lullabies, into the ways grandmothers warn grandchildren not to worship the wrong things. The underworld changes slowly, and in doing so it exerts a gentle influence on the living world. Rituals evolve to include the kind of care that cannot be monetized: the return of a borrowed book, an hour of listening without advice, a meal cooked too plain to be featured on screens. These small things do not make for superstardom, but they do create a culture where the hungry have less to prey upon. Persephone tends these cultural gardens like a farmer tending heirloom seeds, patient, watchful, delighted by incremental growth. In certain quiet corners of the underworld, little shrines appear, improvised memorials to the otherworld's lost heroes that refuse the old impulse to idolize. These shrines are messy, cobbled from discarded things and hand-sewn stories, the kind of keeping places that don't want an audience. People come and leave offerings of paper boats and small stones, tokens that do not scream but hum with private grief. Hades sometimes visits these shrines, touches a stone, and learns the humility of being small and observant in a world that values thunder. The rifts, once violent and flaring, are now tended like blighted orchards with the same practical devotion Persephone uses in her gardens. They are not sealed with absolute finality, such arrogance would be a sin, but are instead made into managed transitions, places where the living can meet the dead for a while under strict, sacred terms. There are rules, written in languages old and new, and rigorous watchmen who patrol the borders with an eye for human frailty. It is imperfect, but it is better than being unmade. Years turn into decades in human time, and stories harden into legends. The tale of Hades and Persephone confronting the Marvel zombies becomes one of many moral generals in the mythology of the age, a parable of restraint and the value of small human acts. The gods do not ask for temples to be raised in their honor, They ask only that people remember to feed their neighbors first and their celebrities last. It is an odd request in an age built on amplification, but it becomes, thanks to the persistent work of many tiny hands, a cultural habit. Persephone grows particularly fond of an old woman who runs a communal kitchen near one fissure, a woman who refuses to be photographed and whose recipe for stew spreads quietly through the city. The old woman refuses fame and offers soup. She becomes a living symbol of everything the gods ask for: care without display, nourishment without betting on virality. Persephone visits her in disguise sometimes, and the two women talk as if they were musicians talking about scales, free and honest. Hades, who once feared irrelevance, finds contentment in anonymity. He watches families sit down to meals that are not artful but honest, and he hears the old lullabies return like migrating birds to particular windows. He keeps a register of small deaths and small births, and he weighs them with infinite patience, because governance is, at its core, the management of endings and beginnings. The underworld becomes, not a grim warehouse of souls, but a place of careful custodianship, where stories are preserved and sometimes repurposed into the quiet architecture of community. The Marvel zombies, in time, become a metaphor and not an army. They appear in cautionary verses and in the warnings of activists who have turned their grief into organizing. The monstrous becomes a lesson in humility. Those who crave attention often starve for intimacy, and the reverse holds true. Myths are stubborn. They adapt to the needs of each era and become tools in the hands of those who would teach their children what to value. Sometimes, in the deepest hour of the night when Persephone walks the borderlands alone, she hears a whisper from the other side, a half-remembered syllable from a hero who might once have been famous and is now merely human and mortal again. It is a sound that makes her knees go soft with both grief and gratitude. She smiles, because in the end her garden grows not by command but by patient tending, and the odd miracle she planted long ago, of attention spread thin and kindness made commonplace, has taken root in a world that once mistook fame for virtue. Hades watches too, and in his watching there is no triumphalism. He knows that vigilance never ends and that new threats will arrive in forms both modern and monstrous. He is ready with law and sternness, but more than that he is ready with a renewed respect for the soft economies of heart. The underworld he rules is wiser for having been tested, and so is the living world that reached back with dirty hands to pray for second chances. The story lingers like incense in the memory of both worlds, a tale not of final victory but of a hard-won recalibration. Persephone and Hades are not paradisiacal saviors, but they are steadfast stewards who learn to translate old wisdom into pragmatic acts for a different age. The Marvel zombies, stripped of their mythic mania, become a lesson in how even modern gods, sung on screens and in stadiums, can be humbled by the most ancient truth of all, that nourishment, care, and the choice to listen sustain worlds far better than appetite and spectacle ever can. Time moves on, quietly, the way rivers do in winter, carrying broken seeds and small surprises under the ice. The underworld remains a place of weight and measure, and the two rulers continue their improbable task of balancing human frailty with cosmic consequence. Persephone plants, Hades binds, and between them a new narrative is stitched, one that insists attention be spent wisely, that stories be kept tender, and that even in a world of monstrous spectacle, human-scale kindness can starve a hunger the size of an apocalypse. There is a place beneath the maps of men, a geography of shadow that refuses the tidy lines of daylight. It answers to many names, but when you listen at night to the low, patient currents of myth you hear its true music, the rivers. They run like veins through the world below, carrying not water but memory, not fish but the slow, inevitable passage of souls toward whatever judgment awaits them. If you have heard the name Styx, you have heard the most terrible and the most binding. The Styx is not merely a river, It is an oath made liquid, a black ribbon that binds gods and mortals to promises they might regret. Imagine a surface like polished obsidian, reflecting nothing but intent, and you will have a beginning of its look, but none of its weight or sound. The ferryman, Sharon, crusted with salt and lullabies of drowned men, stands with a pole like a judge's gavel, a figure both obscene and indispensable. He is not moved by sorrow or plea, but by the mechanics of crossing, the coin, the name, the refusal of the living to follow. His boat is a coffin masquerading as conveyance, gliding over waters that remember every life that has ever been surrendered to them. Beyond the Styx there are other waters, each with its character and appetite. The Lethe slinks like a half-forgotten lullaby, offering that peculiar mercy of erasure, a draught to wash the sharp edges of identity until the self becomes a soft, indistinct thing. The Acheron carries complaint, its current full of restless hands and the tired speech of those who have not yet been heard. Cocytus sings laments in a voice that splits the stones and keeps them crying. Phlegethon roars with a hunger that is more heat than violence, a river of flame that does not burn so much as translate suffering into another language of being. Each channel is an ecosystem of fate, a corridor for adjudication, a classroom where the soul receives its verdict. They are not separate islands, but a braided delta of purpose, meeting and parting as the need for balance demands. Into this architecture of afterlife, imagine the impossible arrival of Atlantis, not as a sunken relic but as a collective will that refuses oblivion. Atlantis does not fit neatly into Greek myth because it is an invention of hope and catastrophe stitched together, yet it clings to the underworld like a rusted anchor. The Atlanteans do not come as bodies alone, they come as a civilization's memory, as libraries of grief and ingenuity that refuse to be buried. The Atlantean presence below changes the rivers, subtly at first and then with the inevitability of tide. If the underworld is a room, Atlantis is a new door suddenly discovered in its far wall, painted with unfamiliar symbols and inviting not merely curiosity but a redesign. Their engineers, if that word can be used for dead men and women, begin to understand the hydraulics of the shades, the architecture of loss, and to reroute currents as if they were canals on a plain. To picture such engineering, think of maps drawn with ink stolen from squid of the deep, diagrams annotated in a hand that knew both bronze and starfinding. The Atlanteans recall their harbors and their mathematics. They remember how to curve a stone to trap and hold water, how to coax a tide to bring ships where men asked. Below, stonework is freer and more urgent. It answers to forces that will not take a bribe. They shape vaults and sluices through the rock of night, and the rivers begin to hum with new harmonics. The first battle beneath the surface is not of swords but of memory and claim. Hades, lord of dead things, perceives an intrusion like a cold in his house, not lethal because it is obvious but because it is annoying and threatening to order. Persephone listens for the footfalls of new traditions. The judges of the dead exchange notes, suspicious and curious in equal measure. There is a debate in the dark. Do these Atlantean souls follow the old rules, or do they bring a new covenant carved from disaster? The soul of a city is not a single mind but a chorus, and that chorus has opinions. Some Atlantean shades insist on their old rights, lineage, property, innovations that once made them proud. Others, stripped of the rituals that upheld them, seek different bargains and different gods. The underworld is a parliamentary thing, and it is as beset by factions as any mortal polis that once argued over grain or harbor fees. When councils fail, the conflict becomes more tangible. The rivers, which up to now were conduits, become instruments. Currents are redirected to isolate enclaves, whirlpools are engineered to hold a cohort for interrogation, and reeds are grown that whisper to sleeping minds. The Atlanteans are practical about their warfare. They do not merely lament, they repave. They lay basalt where grief had been a sticky, useless thing and watch the visitors slip in a new pattern of passage. The greatest danger to the underworld is not violence but transformation. Olympus tolerates a certain amount of change, Zeus is adaptable, and even the old laws can be traded like cattle when the price is right. But the chthonic system derives power from predictability. The river knows who will pass and when, and this steadiness is currency. Atlantis brings innovation, and innovation is contagious. Where one current is rerouted, others must follow, and the map of the afterlife trembles. We must not forget the human detail in all of this. The Atlantean dead are not proper nouns from a textbook, but people who loved and betrayed, who learned the names of flowers and the sound of waves on a certain pier. In the underworld, those private memories are sharpened or dulled by proximity to the rivers, and it is often the little things, an embroidered handkerchief, a child's rhyme, that become leverage in a negotiation. The heart of a city is never far from the heart of an individual, and both are weapons in a place that measures value differently. There is a particular kind of ghost song the Atlanteans bring, the sound of built certainty collapsing. That tone is not merely sorrowful, it is instructive, it teaches other dead how to carry ruin like an art form. When someone who once believed they were untouchable meets the lowly fate of a memory adrift, the lesson circulates. Perversely, such teachings can make the dead more organized, more disciplined in their defiance, and thus more effective. The figure of Charon does not stand aloof to this reorganization. He is practical and has always been capable of bartering with new realities, but he is also old-fashioned in his needs. His fare still matters, but the Atlanteans come with different currencies, favors owed, knowledge of submerged routes, bargains struck between captains and priests. Charon learns the weight of a city's promise and sometimes accepts it as payment, for power in the underworld is fungible and always hungry. If the Styx is an oath, then Atlantis brings chants that sound like contracts, a liturgy of the sea. Their priests, those that survive as a caste in the shadows, recite formulas older than the written word, and their words twist around the river like ropes. These are not supplications of the meek, they are declarations of intent. They are also surgical, designed to extract from the underworld the things the Atlanteans need: momentum, space, the ability to be heard on the other side of judgment. The judges of the dead, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, do not take kindly to amendments to the code. Minos listens with a patience honed on scale and balance. Rhadamanthus, once a king of a particular island, remembers the warmth of rule and feels only half an enemy to the Atlanteans. Aeacus judges with a justice as blunt and blunt-edged as a plow. They are each tempted by bribes and arguments, by proof and performance, and the Atlanteans are quick learners in the school of persuasion. There are scenes in which a court of the dead becomes theater. An Atlantean artisan reconstructs a harbor in miniature, complete with models of ships and the sound of gulls snagged in a bottle. He demonstrates how currents can be guided, how memory can be stored in patterns of stone and lamp. The judges watch, sometimes they are moved, and sometimes they are enraged. The verdicts that follow are architectural as much as legal: sandbars moved, passageways sealed, adjudications that rearrange whole neighborhoods of shadow. Other forces are at play besides the courts and engineers. Orphic echoes and Eleusinian rites murmur through corridors, reminding the dead of mysteries old enough to be blind. There are whispers of initiations, of secret names and songs that dissolve boundaries between life and afterlife. The Atlanteans are both fascinated and repelled by these cults. They see ritual as an engine and a key, something to be adopted if it proves useful and rejected if it demands more than they are willing to surrender. Magic in this underworld is a craft like any other, and the Atlanteans are adept craftspeople. They learn how to braid enchantments into cables and how to place votive offerings where currents might eat them and make them luminous. In their hands, a votive becomes a beacon, and a beacon becomes a claim. The Underworld, which once expected uniform torpor, finds itself lit with the stubborn brightness of a people who do not accept finality as a personal term. There are alliances formed that would shock the poets of the living world. A shade of a captain pledges to watch an amphora of song, and a thrall bard from another age is tasked to keep its melody from unraveling. A coalition grows, not of nations but of needs, architects, mourners, priests, and certain obstinate exiles who refuse to accept a tidy rest. They share knowledge like contraband, and each secret is a brick in the refounding of things below. This nascent Atlantean polity does not go unopposed. Hades himself dispatches shadowy agents, nightmares that leak into slumbers, bureaucrats who insist on forms written in blood. They are subtle. Rather than assaulting with obvious force, they create obstacles that are administrative and slow. It is an ugly warfare where forms are missing, seals are forged, and the simplest passage is held up as if by a leash. The Atlanteans respond with cunning more apt than valor. They design rituals of paperwork, liturgies that pass inspections because they fold both law and prayer. They create memos that are also charms, edicts that rearrange the bureaucratic geography of the dead. This bureaucratic sorcery is as essential as any blade, for in a place organized by decrees and precedent, the shape of a declaration can become a moat. The rivers themselves sometimes rebel against any single authority. Currents can be coaxed, pulled into eddies where time thickens and judgment slows, and when this happens, souls can wait and whisper and plan. In those quiet eddies of stream, entire strategies are born: how to unseat a judge, how to claim a ferry, how to reroute a flow to reveal a map that had been hidden under a silt of law. These plans unfold like the slow construction of a canal, painstaking and precise. There is a human cost to such planning. For every grand design, someone must hold the line, endure privation, accept erasure. The Atlantean chorus contains both the ambitious and the resigned, and it is the resigned who often sacrifice the most, taking on roles as feeders of ritual fires or as guardians of memory vessels. Their stories are dull in the sense of routine but incandescent in the lights they keep burning. Under a city rebuilt in shadow, you can find altars tended by those who believe they are invisible, and those altars are the foundation of any revolution. You might ask what victory would look like on a map of darkness. The Atlanteans do not seek to overthrow the gods. Such hubris belongs to a certain genre of tragedy. Instead, they aim to secure a place where the memory of their city can be preserved and articulated, a kind of sanctuary where the identity of a people is not continually dissolved by the communal tides. Victory looks like archives, like safe channels for passage, like the ability to call a name and be heard across the Styx. Yet power breeds its own complications. As the Atlanteans grow organized beneath, they begin to seek influence above. If memory is a commodity, they wish to trade it for sanctuary, for options. Their emissaries learn to speak not only to the judges but to the living, to haunt the dreams of certain mariners or to implant the longing for home in the hearts of descendants. The living world becomes another theater in which the underworld's policies are advanced through subtler warfare. These hauntings are cinematic in the smallness of their details. A fisherman finds his net snagged on an old bronze piece that bears an unfamiliar seal, and with that talisman comes a dream of a city he never saw. A potter dreams of a glaze his grandmother used to make, and wakes filled with a pattern that belongs to the Atlantean memory. Such reveries guide the living into acts of remembrance, and when the living remember, the dead grow stronger. Not all of Atlantis' influence is manipulative. There is a tenderness in their reconstructions, a desire to honor crafts and songs without coercion. They are archivists as much as activists, translating the fragile into the durable, singing lullabies into stone so that they will not be lost to rust. Some of their projects look like museums, galleries of memory where each relic is allowed to tell its own small history under a dim, careful light. There arises, inevitably, resistance from other dead who see in the Atlantean insistence a threat to diversity. Why should any one city be granted a vault in the underworld when the whole empire of shades is already cramped? Old rivalries flare up, and neighborhoods of shade close their gates. Skirmishes, though non-lethal in the mortal sense, are fierce in their psychic cruelty, memory stolen, reputations slashed, rituals blocked. It is in this climate that a martial tradition forms, not of metal and blood but of reputation and story. The Atlanteans deploy narratives like armor. They forge lineages through invented genealogies and resurrect forgotten heroes to serve as symbols. Their poets become generals, and their orators are as dangerous as any blade because a single persuasive tale can turn a neighborhood of shades away from an opposing magistrate. A striking phenomenon follows: the creation of hybrid deities beneath the earth. The Atlanteans and other communities begin to worship in a syncretic fashion, combining names and epithets until the very idea of a god becomes pliable. These hybrid gods are not strangers to the Greeks. Syncretism has always been a part of their faith. But below, where precedent once reigned supreme, this mixing is revolutionary. It redefines duty and reshapes allegiance in practical terms. When gods are remade, cults change their liturgies and temples rearrange their stones. The Eleusinian mysteries might be recited over an altar that smells of salt, and a prayer to Demeter might be followed by a hymn to an Atlantean patron who once sponsored granaries. Such reconnections create new paths for souls, new expectations for ritual competence, and new points of friction when an old deity resents being asked to share power. This pressure produces a kind of theological bartering. Promises made by priests to their congregants are traded like favors. The maintenance of an altar might be exchanged for a right to a channel's current. The underworld develops a marketplace of legitimacy, and credit moves in forms of storytelling and ritual competence. In turn, those who can invent convincing liturgies rise to positions of influence, and sometimes entire neighborhoods realign behind new mythologies. The Atlantean engineers extend their reach by turning to what the Greeks call daimons, lesser spirits, often overlooked but crucial. They bind these spirits into constructs, talismans that maintain a current, guardian shades that patrol a museum of memory. These demons are not malicious by nature but by necessity. When asked to enforce canton laws, they become proxies of governance. Each binding is a moral act, because to command a daimon is to decide what parts of the past will be allowed to glow. To anchor their projects, Atlanteans cultivate a new kind of priesthood, one that is both technological and spiritual. The priests know how to tend the mechanisms of memory while also reading omens in the foam of the river. They mesh bronze knowledge with hymnology, with temples that are as much workshops as sanctuaries. In their hands, a rite might conclude with the careful tightening of a sluice gate as readily as with the pouring of wine. Conflict escalates when a faction of ancient dead sees the Atlantean triumphs as a threat to the cosmic architecture. These antagonists are not purely mythic. They are the pious technocrats of the dark, who believe that the underworld's stability rests on unchange. They mount rebellions of obstruction, setting ambushes in halls of memory and forging seals that render certain artifacts mute. The war thus gains a bureaucratic antiseptic, full of nullifications and countersigns. The Atlanteans, who once were a maritime culture, now display a genius for propaganda. Their narratives spread like a refined oil through the corridors of the afterlife, lubricating doors and greasing the hinges of stubborn hearts. They tell stories of a city not as a place of pride, but as a community of survivors, people who faced ruin and taught themselves to rebuild. This posture wins sympathies, particularly among those who themselves had once been subject to catastrophe. There are intimate moments in the conflict, moments when an Atlantean mother manages to recover a child's lullaby from a neighboring shade and sings it into a river to be caught and carried back to another tomb. These recoveries are small victories, but they matter as proof of care. In a place where erosion of identity is constant, even a single song can become a banner. The politics of tenderness is underrated but devastatingly effective. At times, the underworld feels like a theater of echoes, where gestures are repeated and reframed until meaning itself is contested. An Atlantean shipwright reclaims the term founder that once condemned them and uses it instead to denote creative resilience. Words, and that shadow, become weapons and tools, and battles are often won by lexicons rather than spears. This linguistic warfare is a quiet art, requiring both memory and timing. There is a slow accretion of institutions. Atlantean schools arise to teach lost crafts, and archives are organized under clerks who can recite generations of trade secrets. These schools are paradoxically popular. A craftsman who learns to repair a memory is as valuable as any judge. The underworld becomes more professionalized, and that professionalization changes expectations. The dead begin to expect competence and services, not merely fate. This shift produces economic consequences. If memory can be conserved and curated, it has value, and value attracts caretakers and collectors. A guild forms around the maintenance of world seals, and a merchant class rises to trade in commemorations. Entire careers develop around the art of preservation. Men who once fought as captains now run vaults and trade in stories. The marketization of the dead is both practical and morally ambiguous, but it proves resilient. Inevitably, the living world takes notice in slivers and superstitions. Towns near the old purported sites of Atlantis report strange tides and sleep, or fishermen bring home relics whose bronze is unweathered by time. Sailors whisper at taverns about currents that feel watched, and poets compose sonnets to cities they have never seen. These ripples manifest as art, and when art depicts the underworld, it often softens the borders between states, causing the living to contort their behavior in tiny but real ways. A crucial development occurs when the Atlanteans succeed in making pilgrimage possible to their underworld archives. Not in a literal sense, for the living cannot simply walk beneath the earth, but in translation, a ritual performed by the living becomes a bridge, a visiting card that opens doors. Pilgrimages manifest as elaborate commemorations performed in the living world that authorize certain spirits to be called forward. Such authorized presences create a hybrid democracy between life and afterlife. With such bridges in place, the political geography below begins to export culture upward. Atlantean motifs appear in pottery, in lullabies, and in the syncretic rites of coastal towns. A festival once consumed with honoring Athena might now include a stanza to a sea god freshly titled with an Atlantean epithet. When the living adopt these rituals, they unwittingly become agents of change, performing the very gestures that shore up Atlantean claims under the earth. There is a poignancy to all of this that is hard to ignore. A civilization learned to translate its expertise into survivability. Yet the more successful they are, the more complicated their moral landscape becomes. To preserve a city's memory, they must decide what to include and what to forget, and every choice is a verdict on a life. The art of curation thus forces impossible choices, and the ethical debates that follow are as bitter as any war. Those ethical debates are not merely abstract. They affect funerary rites, inheritance rights, and the rights of descendants. Who may inherit a memory is a legal and emotional question. Families petition the underworld courts to restore a song or to seal a rumor. The Atlanteans are both plaintiffs and defendants in a system that treats history as property, and this legalism has a human texture: late-night witnesses, faded seals, testimony couched in tears. In time, a new pattern emerges, one that the old gods cannot easily assimilate or dismiss. A coalition of cities, some descended from Atlantean refugees, some ancient rivals, begin to treat the underworld as a partner rather than a prison. They sign pacts of remembrance and establish shared festivals that span the world above and the realm below. When ritual becomes reciprocal, it becomes a form of diplomacy, and diplomacy is the slowest but most enduring victory. Hades, who is often portrayed as cold, is not indifferent to these developments. There are scenes where he contemplates the ledger of souls with a kind of reluctant admiration. He recognizes efficiency and order when he sees them. But his primary concern remains balance, and balance is threatened when any party grows too strong. He maneuvers with a stately cunning, cajoling and constraining, reminding all that even the cleverest plans must accommodate the architecture of fate. Persephone, who divides her time between pomegranate and petition, acts as an unpredictable mediator. She is at once sympathetic to those who seek renewal and mindful of the old seasons that must remain. Her presence complicates negotiations, because she represents both the possibility of rebirth and the undeniable cycles that keep the earth turning. Her favor is a prize worth more than any coin in the underworld's markets. As the chapters of conflict and conversion unfold, the rivers themselves begin to bear artifacts of hybrid culture. Styx water sparkled at certain bends with lamp oil poured in a century before, while Lethe reeds hum with tunes taught by Atlantean brides. The rivers become carriers not only of souls but of culture, and their banks sprout graves that are catalogued and curated like important works of art. This landscape resembles a museum crossed with a funeral parade, solemn and vivid. What happens to heroes in such a remade underworld is instructive. The Atlanteans resurrect a kind of civic heroism, figures who can be invoked to stoke courage in both the living and the dead. These heroes are not simple and they are not purely noble, they carry the contradictions of their age. They teach a curriculum of resilience that tolerates compromise and celebrates craft, reshaping the lessons future generations will learn about what it means to endure. There are also darker rehearsals of revenge. Not all Atlanteans accept gentle diplomacy, and some form clandestine cells that seek to reassert force in a place that was never meant for open warfare. These cells undertake sabotage, whispering rumors into the ears of ferrymen and unmooring boats to set currents on altered paths. Such attempts often backfire because the underworld is not merely a stage for vengeance, it corrects itself through mechanisms both legal and uncanny. The unpredictable elements of fate manifest through accidents and coincidences that have a moral weight all their own. A storm roars above the waves and sinks a ship that carries a crucial relic, or a child among the living sneezes and in so doing triggers a small ritual in a coastal shrine, the outcome of which feeds back into the underworld. Fate is not content to be scripted, it intrudes with its own tastes, reminding everyone that plans can be thwarted by the smallest happenstance. There is a curious democratization that accompanies the Atlantean reforms. Where once the judges and big cults dominated, now skilled artisans and humble archivists have voices. A seamstress who preserves a pattern of prayer is consulted like an oracle, a former fisherman who knows the current's moods becomes an advisor. The center of gravity in the underworld shifts from aristocratic adjudication to functional expertise, and this rearrangement yields a governance that prizes capability. Yet old resentments do not vanish overnight. The memories of injustice fester, and some corners of the underworld become hotbeds of nostalgia for a time when hierarchies were simpler. These nostalgias are dangerous, for they idealize an order that was often cruel. Romanticizing the past provides fodder for reactionary movements that aim to restore a pre-Atlantean status quo, and these movements find adherents among those who have most to fear from change. The tension between conservation and innovation is the narrative engine of this entire drama. The underworld must decide whether it is repository or workshop, museum or factory, and that question becomes the axis around which politics, religion, and daily life turn. The Atlanteans argue passionately for workshop, their opponents prefer the tranquility of a museum. The final form of the underworld, whatever it becomes, will be something of a compromise, and the process of that compromise is the story's true heat. There are moments of genuine beauty that puncture the strategizing and the scheming. A festival in which the living and the dead jointly commemorate a child who died at sea becomes an act of shared sorrow and shared resolve. Songs are sung from both sides of the veil, and for a night the rivers reflect constellations familiar to both worlds. Such events remind participants why they fight, not for power alone but for the human work of remembering and honoring. In the end, the battle below is less a single war and more an ongoing negotiation, a series of treaties and ruptures that shape generations of myth and law. Atlantis' entry into the underworld forces all parties to reconsider the meaning of death in civic terms and to imagine governance as something that can be renewed rather than merely inherited. The rivers remain, but they run different courses, threaded now with the artifacts and strategies of a people who refuse to be simplified. The legacy of this subterranean struggle echoes in the living world as well, and stories told to children, and laws written by lawmakers who once heard strange dreams, and in festivals where the names of the drowned are spoken aloud. Plato's tale of Atlantis was always more than a moral. As legend transforms into reality in the hands of the dead, it becomes a tool for cultural survival. The underworld's rivers, having borne a city, widen to accommodate many currents, and in doing so they teach the living about flexibility and the price of preservation. So when you drive alone at night and the highway hums like a distant river, consider the possibility that beneath the maps lies a place negotiating its identity. Imagine a city of engineers and poets bargaining with judges and gods, rerouting memory and redirecting currents so that a people's songs endure. The rhythms of their work are not unlike our own, patient, incremental, and stubborn, an insistence that history can be held and shaped rather than surrendered to easy decay. The Marvel Zombies hunt continues, a recurring chapter in the Labyrinth's vast manuscript. They test the boundaries of identity and consent and teach the dead new vocabularies of caution and trickery in return. The Labyrinth, wise in its sculptural patience, files these interactions, making a more complex map, and waits for the next strange thing to arrive with the same indifferent curiosity it chose to weather. There is a place beneath the world that smells of ancient stone and iron, where light forgets to travel and sound learns new shapes. The Greeks called it Tartarus, a pit deeper than any ocean, a place where gods glanced and grew quiet, where punishment and exile were folded into the bedrock of the earth. In older stories it is the hinge of cosmic justice, the anchor of the vault of night, but in this telling it becomes something else entirely, the site of the last gate, a threshold that remembers every despair and echoes every last breath that crossed its sill. It is a gate not only of stone but of story, and stories are hungry things in the dark. To speak of the last gate of Tartarus is to speak of boundaries, between mortal and immortal, between life and a perverse imitation of it, between the living and the shambling hunger of what we will call the Marvel Zombies. These were not ordinary zombies. They carried ideas like contagion, and fame like fleas. They were infected echoes of heroes and villains, sunlight casts of names that once held meaning. They were born in a world of comics and myth, but they found a way to bleed into the grooves of ancient nether realms because stories do not respect borders once they learn how to travel. Tartarus, in its patient gravity, became a trap and a crucible for those wandering narratives, and the last gate watched them as one watches a slow, terrible experiment. From the surface, the approach to the underworld looked like a bruise on the map. Travelers who sought it described a landscape that shifted its contours with memory, a geography grown from regrets and the names people could not say aloud. Rivers ran backward, carrying memories like leaves. Mountains leaned in to listen. The path to Tartarus refused to be straightforward. It required a relinquishing of who you had been and a willingness to be watched by the voices of your own doubts. Those who crossed it found the world quieter, as if the air itself had been put on hold. Entrances to Tartarus in myth are often guarded by monstrous custodians, and the last gate was no different. It had sentinels that were less beasts than verdicts, stitched together concepts that huddled like vultures. There were statues whose eyes were written sentences from trials long past, and there were choruses that repeated the same accusation until their voices broke. The last gate demanded to know why anyone came, and it listened carefully to every answer because answers have weight in places where nothing is measured by distance. Many turned away, those who did not had a way of feeling the world change beneath their feet. The Marvel zombies did not arrive like a plague so much as a rumor that hardened into flesh. At first they were a stylistic contagion, a way of telling stories where glories were drained to feed hunger, where capes and logos crinkled like old leaves. When narrative energy turned to appetite, the creatures became anchored to bodies, heroes who awoke with the knowledge of who they had been and an insatiable need to consume that identity in others. In a world where names meant power, consumption became a means of hoarding legacy. They were grotesquely efficient at it, carrying the faces of gods and the manners of kings, but with the single, terrible purpose of prolonging themselves by erasing other names. The first of the Marvel zombies to stumble into Tartarus were anomalies, lost missives of calamity that slipped through the cracks of modern paperlands and comic book seas. They found the Underworld a natural habitat because Tartarus had always specialized in locking away forces that upset the order of things. The gatekeepers recognized them, not because they had seen a zombie before, but because they recognized the hunger for consequence rather than for simple flesh. Tartarus does not have a future, but it has a very long memory, and it remembers the taste of stories the same way others remember bread and wine. The zombies, in turn, adapted, learning that consuming a story here meant swallowing the echo of it for longer than any normal corpse could keep warm. When the Marvel zombies began to feed inside Tartarus, their consumption warped the place. Where they ate, myths grew thinner and sometimes unraveled into threads of light that darted like frightened insects. Atlas groaned as if bearing a new, heavier sky because the zombies did not simply take flesh, they unstitched meaning. They reinterpreted punishment into spectacle, transmuting moral weight into something like a carnival mirror. That bending worried the old custodians. Tartarus is a containment of necessary cruelties, not a playground for hungry fame. The last gate, which had watched empires be sentenced and heroes be stripped, began to close in ways no one had recorded before. There were others who sought the last gate because the last gate was a kind of answer, and answers often draw the desperate. Priests, prophets, scholars, and thieves made offerings to cross the threshold, some hoping to bargain or plead, others to steal secrets. Each visitor altered the gate by their presence. One might coax a hinge, another might bribe a lock to sing. The Marvel zombies were different from these mortals because they left nothing pliant behind. Their appetite calcified the attempts at negotiation. Where a supplicant left a petition, the zombies left a hollow echo, and the gate learned to expect hollows. To understand why the last gate is so vital, you must understand the economy of meaning in Tartarus. The Underworld stores more than bodies. It archives offenses and forgotten vows, the shame of nations and the quiet promises whispered into graves. These are the raw materials of myth, and myths are currency. The Marvel zombies, by feeding on fame and identity, threatened to siphon that currency into a single, greedy account. They made story into a commodity to be hoarded rather than a river to be shared, and what they took could not be reclaimed in the same way. The gate existed to prevent such accumulation of narrative power into predators' bellies. Tales told of a mechanism embedded in the last gate, not a lock in any ordinary sense, but an adjudication of consequence. To pass, one had to surrender an account of themselves so precise and unvarnished that the gate could weigh it against the ledger of all other accounts. Mortals faltered because people do not want to be so fully seen. The Marvel zombies, being amalgams of identity and hunger, attempted a different tactic. They tried to mimic confession, but with hollow cadence and flamboyant detail meant to distract. The Gate, practiced in separating show from substance, grew wary of mimicry, and in that warying it began to change shape. There came a season when the Marvel zombies learned to use the Gate to their advantage. They discovered that Tartarus, for all its ancient protocols, could be tricked by a new kind of lie, one wrapped in the glitter of celebrity and packaged with an appetizing backstory. Each time one of them convinced a sentinel, the Gate absorbed new habits and adjusted its scale. The piecework of myth, delicate as cobwebs, unraveled slightly, thread by thread. The custodians held council in stone rooms that made no air and agreed that something unprecedented required a measure beyond old law. Their choice was difficult, for Tartarus acts rarely. It prefers the slow calculus of retribution to sudden execution. But the last gate had limits, and the contagion threatened them. A small cohort of those who dwelt in the deeper archives proposed a ritual older than punishment, a thing whispered by the naked bones of those who had once been gods. It was a closure, not of killing but of final recognition, an ending that required the dark to remember the names it had swallowed and then to release them all at once. They called it the Reckoning. It demanded a willing sacrifice from someone who could hold memory in a place where memory was not commonly kept. The difficulty was not in the ritual itself, but in finding the willing mind. Tartarus does not have hands to perform rites, so it needed an emissary. The emissary chosen was unlikely, and that unlikelihood is where hope often hides. This emissary was not a god, nor a hero awarded in song. It was a librarian of sorts, a mortal who had spent a lifetime indexing the small obsessions of humanity, songs that died before they became famous, lovers' names carved on unimportant trees, the grimy notes scribbled in margins of cheap paperbacks. She had learned how memory clung to objects and how objects could be coaxed into admitting what they had seen. She journeyed down with a satchel of tokens, each one a compacted history, and the Gate took her because it recognized the honesty of her trade. Her hands smelled of ink and dust, and there is a power in those scents in places where everything else smells of iron and patience. The librarian approached the last gate with humility and tremor. She had read every myth that might warn her or instruct her, and in the quiet of the underworld she found the instructions wanting in contemporary things. The reckoning she was to perform required telling a story backwards, not the tale of how the zombies came, but the catalog of what they had taken and what those things meant to the world that had known them. She began to speak, and with each name recalled she deposited a token into the dark, a child's toy, a folded photograph, a scrap of song. These offerings were small, ordinary, and precise. They held the texture of lives rather than the gleam of legend. The Gate found them interesting. Small things are often precise in ways grand items are not. As she spoke, the Marvel zombies pressed at the threshold from the other side with a noise like pages flapping in a storm. They sensed the possibility of feast. Their hunger had never been purely physical, and as the librarian narrated the lives behind the things, a strange effect occurred. The zombies remembered the fullness of what they had consumed. Memory is a dangerous diet. When you force a creature that survives on reduction to confront the whole of what it reduced, it experiences the inverse of satiation. It experiences unmaking. The zombies staggered as they heard not merely names but histories, and in the exposure there was a vulnerability. The last gate did not operate in mere law but in the poetry of balance. When the librarian recited, she was not merely listing, she was restoring. Names returned weight. Stories reclaimed their edges. The Marvel zombies found themselves assaulted not by swords but by context, by the facts of love and shame and tedium that had made their victims human. One by one, the hollow imitations that had passed for identities began to leak. They attempted to resist, to fight back with parodies of remorse, but such parodies are brittle in the face of lived detail. The gate listened and recorded each reversal. Its hinges creaked with the sound of long-suppressed truths finding air. There was a particular moment when the oldest of the zombies, a creature once worshipped as a near-immortal demigod of spectacle, stumbled and bared an image of its own beginning. Before, this being had been a symbol, sharp, admired, and dangerous, and the silence around the symbol had fed it. The librarian named the small, ridiculous things that person had loved: a mediocre pastry, a letter left unsent, a funny scar on a shoulder from an adolescent fall. The enormous thing that had once been a star shrank like a shadow fooled by noon, and in that shrinking something else was revealed. Humanity had been beneath the grandeur all along. Here, under the last gate, the spectacle could not hold without the scaffolding of ordinary detail. But even as the reckoning unstitched the glamour from the predators, Tartarus itself began to tremble. The underworld had held many terrible things by corralling them into the shape of punishment. To free names and restore context was to change the nature of the cage. What if justice suddenly grew merciful, or what if mercy learned to be eternal? The ancient custodians worried because the world above needed consequences to maintain its order. The reckoning might cure the immediate problem of ravenous story eaters, but could spawn other dilemmas: forgiveness without reckoning, remembrance without learning. These considerations hung in stone silence, and even the gate hesitated. The librarian continued without regard to cosmic politics. She knew her trade and the terrible ethics of naming, and she was careful with each utterance. She could feel the drag of history and the weight of each token she placed into Tartarus's hands. The Marvel zombies shoved and snarled and mimicked grief to try to stop her, but mimicry cannot replicate the particular ties of a life. A name uttered with its mundane accoutrements is an anchor. It will not be lifted by mimicry because mimicry feeds on recognition, not on detail. The last gate, as it absorbed these human details, glowed faintly like a star that has learned a new vocabulary. As the reckoning unfolded, memories that had been swallowed by the zombies returned not as single threads but as tapestries. People in distant towns began to find traces of things they had thought lost: a childhood song hummed by a baker, a poem remembered by an old woman at the market, a saved photograph found in a forgotten book. These ripples were not magic in the flashy sense, they were consequences of the ledger being balanced. Tartarus does not leak whimsically, but when the ledger shifts, the world adjusts. The glamour that fed the zombies cracked and peeled like varnish in sun, revealing what lay beneath: vulnerability, error, kindness, boredom, and fierce smallness. The zombies howled at the intensity of it. Not all the creatures were undone at once. Some were more tenacious, facets of hunger that had learned to take on layers of mimicry as armor. One of them had once been a figure who thrived on contrast, the drama of duality. It mirrored other people's pain and called it its own. When faced with the reckoning, it attempted to absorb the librarian's tokens, to devour the small items and thereby erase the context once again. But the gate does not respond to brute appetite. It responds to sincerity, and the librarian's confession had been precise enough to pare away the mimicry. In the end, the creature could not hold both the borrowed weight and the truth of what had been borrowed. Something had to give, and it was the pretense that shattered. Another of the zombies was a quiet kind that had only recently remembered its own hunger, a late conversion whose appetite was earnest and confused rather than triumphant. The reckoning affected it differently. When the librarian named the trivial cares that had once sustained the people it had eaten, it did not lash out so much as wince. This creature had been more feed than predator at first, an accident of narrative infection rather than a chosen path. The process of remembering restored a kind of mourning in it that had been absent, and without the bright edge of hunger the creature dissolved into an elegy that Tartarus registered as a return rather than a punishment. The underworld, and witnessing this softer collapse, learned something about nuance the ancient custodians had not considered. Stories being what they are, the reckoning did not go unopposed from within the mortal world. There were those on the surface who feared the undoing of spectacle because spectacle is profitable and easy. Publishers and pundits, priests of popular memory, found their interests threatened by an underworld that returned names with no flourish. They whispered in forums and gathered in rooms with little lamps, arguing that stories needed to be distilled into icons to be useful. They feared the idea that the smallest details of people could alter the cultural currency they traded in. This resistance framed the reckoning as dangerous not because it was cruel, but because it threatened a stable and lucrative way of forgetting. The librarian worried about that too, though she remained committed to the work. She recognized that some kinds of forgetting lubricate society. We cannot all carry every small hurt. But what distinguished useful forgetting from predatory forgetting was agency. When a thing is erased to maintain a power imbalance, it becomes theft. When two people agree to forgive, it's grace. The last gate's intervention reset agency in a way that rattled many vested interests. The librarian had no illusions that all would be well, but she could feel, like a spine being reconnected, that something true was returning to the world. She was neither sentimental nor cold, she simply believed in the stubborn particularity of things. There were personal costs. Recalling every name and every petty truth is exhausting for a human mind. The librarian felt memory as a heavy garment that must be carried physically at times. Her hands cramped, her voice wore thin, and she often found herself pausing to lay down a token and catch her breath. The zombies seized the pauses and tried to rally, but the gate, learning the rhythm of genuine fatigue, would not be tricked by stalling. In the vulnerable quiet, the librarian meditated on the small things, the weight of a coin in a pocket, the way a cat curls against the heat of a human's legs, the exact flavor of a goodbye. These details were potent medicine where swords would have failed. There came a point when the gate itself seemed to do something that had been unheard of in millennia. It spoke. Not in words, but in a shifting of stone that conveyed meaning as clearly as a sentence. It did not condemn the Marvel zombies the way the old myths had once condemned titans and tricksters. Instead, it offered a form of containment that resembled rehabilitation more than execution. The gate proposed a new room in Tartarus, an annex rather than a pit, where the stolen contexts could be kept intact but under observation, where the zombies might be made to listen to what they had devoured. This proposition was revolutionary because it recognized the possibility of change, even in hunger. The librarians in the stone chambers argued. Change, by its nature, is frightening. Not everyone trusted the gate. Some of the custodians preferred the old calculus, containment, suppression, and exemplary suffering. They feared that any softening would leak into the world and erase deterrence. It led to debate, stone arguing with stone, about the ethics of change. Heavy things do not change easily, but the gate had been moved by the precision of the librarian's gestures and the unveiling of so many small truths. Those who feared mercy did not lack moral conviction, they feared the unpredictability of mercy. In their fear they proposed harsher rituals, but even their harshest plans faltered when faced with the tangible rehabilitation of the creatures that had, in private, learned humility. The Marvel zombies, as an ensemble, did not transform in unison. Their fate spread across a spectrum, some returned to something resembling life, carrying scars of memory, some dissolved into silence, having found in the reckoning the end of their story, and some remained stubbornly hungry, a reminder that not all appetites can be fed by names. The last gate gradually adopted a layered protocol. For those who could be taught, there was a longer chorus of remembrance. For those irredeemably predatory, there was a preservation of consequence that was neither spectacle nor annihilation but an honest and unglorious holding. The world above slowly adapted to these changes, and as it did so, the texture of fame and memory altered in ways that people would argue about for generations. Outside, the cultural effect was subtle but relentless. Comic books and stories that had once reveled in reduce and conquer narratives found themselves approached by new authors who wrote with an obsession for details. Readers noticed the change before institutions did. They grew hungrier for the small, stubborn realities that make characters live. The business of telling stories had to learn to respect the margin, because the underworld's reckoning had made margins matter. This recalibration did not eradicate spectacle, but it tempered it. Heroes now could be monstrous and tender in the same paragraph, and audiences learned how dangerous that could be. There were moments of beauty in the aftermath. A small town discovered a mural that had been eaten away by time and gossip, and when people from many places came to restore it, they learned the story of the woman whose face had been painted there. They told and retold it with such tender exactness that the mural regained more than color. It regained the ordinary sorrows and joys of the woman who had been forgotten. When the Marvel zombies had fed on her story, they had left a silhouette. The reckoning replaced the silhouette with the embroidery of a life. The gate watched such moments and hummed, pleased in an inscrutable way. Tartarus is not sentimental, but it recognizes form when it sees it. Yet not all outcomes were poetic. There were towns who discovered that their myths were essential to their cohesion in ways once thought entirely righteous. To have a shared, simplified story sometimes is necessary to survive atrocity and keep people fed. The return of nuance complicated the way communities processed grief and honor. Some insisted that the reckoning had been selfish, an act of academic vanity that pulled apart the threads holding them together. These complaints were not trivial. They reflected the trade-offs inherent in any deep reckoning. The folk of the surface negotiated these compromises as every people must, awkwardly, painfully, and with occasional grace. The librarian herself aged in the process, and the last gate watched her with a tenderness that surprised even the stones. She had not set out to be a savior. She had been a specialist in attention, and attention is a kind of power. When her voice finally thinned completely, the gate recorded her as part of the archive and, in an odd inversion, gave her a small place of rest within Tartarus's annex. She did not disappear into punishment but was kept with the tokens she had loved, allowed to listen as the world adjusted. For her, this was not a consolation but a completion. She had helped repair a hole in the world that had been growing for generations. Her work was done in a way only a careful hand could achieve. Even as the reckoning wound down, the last gate retained changes. It bore new marks like fossils, grooves where caregiving had been bargaining, stains where grief had washed over stone. New ceremonies rose up around it, humble, flawed rituals performed by people who wanted to remember more precisely without losing the ability to forgive. Pilgrims brought tokens not to bribe the gate but to teach it the small delights it had never known. Tartarus, which had once specialized in punishment, developed a reputation for a different kind of justice, one less theatrical but perhaps more sustainable. The gate had learned a new function, not merely a boundary that condemned, but a place that could also reintegrate. The Marvel zombies became a cautionary tale for a world hungry for spectacle and quick absolution. Parents used their story to explain how dangerous it could be to make mascots of real people. Students studied the reckoning in history classes not as an abstract moral but as an example of cultural triage. The creatures who had once been ravenous were taught in workshops within the annexed rooms to listen, to catalog small loves with care, and to give back pieces of what they had stolen. Progress was neither linear nor complete, but the measure was visible. Where once there had been a voracious rhythm, there was now a patchwork of repair, and repair has its own arc of beauty. Not everyone celebrated. There were purists who missed the clarity of the old divide, the crispness of punishments that were simple and terrifying. They wrote manifestos about the dangers of the last gate's softness, envisioning a relapse into old appetites. Some of their fears proved prescient in isolated pockets where the recalibration had been half-hearted and the predators opportunistic. But there were tours of the annex that showed those critics' lives lived suddenly richer for the return of context. A neighbor's confession kept a family from repeat tragedy. A publicly remembered shame stopped a politician from further deceit. These mundane victories were not spectacular enough to make headlines, but they formed the slow scaffolding of a different moral imagination. In the end, what the last gate taught the world was not that all monsters could be healed, or that punishment was unnecessary, but that naming is a kind of responsibility. To remember is to hold custody of others, and to hold custody without cruelty requires attention to the small things. It is a liturgy of ordinary care rather than grand gestures. The Marvel zombies had prompted an ancient place to evolve because hunger, when pressed, reveals what it is really feeding on. Tartarus did not become kind per se, it became a stricter, more discerning steward of narrative consequences. That is a kind of stern mercy. The mythic character of the story changed as storytellers retold it, as myths always do. Some versions simplified the role of the librarian into a goddess of memory, which made pamphlets and prayers easier. Other versions made the last gate a violent figure once again, arguing that the better world was one that did not negotiate with hunger. In taverns and lecture halls, bards and professors argued about the proper moral of the tale. Yet the deeper, quieter truth remained: the change was messy, not miraculous. It took a stubborn human habit, paying attention, to salvage a world where identity had been commodified. If you listen closely, those who tend to archives and old things tell this story in a low voice and for a reason. They mean to remind the listener that the trouble begins when we begin to reduce the particular into the iconic, because icons are easier to trade, and trade is an efficient forgetter. The Marvel zombies were not only monsters, they were a symptom of a culture that valued fame above texture. The last gate responded not with annihilation but with an insistence on particulars, because particulars have a stubborn gravitational pull back toward life. That pull is perhaps what saved them, and what changed Tartarus. The ending, or, more accurately, the rearrangement, was not cinematic in the way headlines prefer. There was no single battle where light prevails in a burst of music. Change is rarely like that. It was an extended negotiation between an ancient place and a modern pathology, between the appetite for easy narrative and the patience required to maintain the real. The last gate remained a gate, keeping some things out and keeping some things in, but it learned how to host a kind of restorative stay. It taught the world a small, durable lesson, that rescue begins in the details and that to love a story is to love its mundane edges. Long after the librarian's voice emptied, other hands took up tokens and continued to feed the archives of Tartarus not with grand offerings but with the small, stubborn items of daily living. They taught volunteers to speak names the way one names a child, with affection and bluntness commingled. Schools taught children the brief exercises of recall, ceremonials where they learned to recall not only heroes but the strangers who baked bread for them, repaired shoes, and taught them to tie scarf knots. The last gate slowly influenced the way communities valued histories, not as trophies to be displayed but as tissues to be mended when worn. This cultural change was imperfect, but it was cumulative, and cumulative things last. In the quiet that followed, storytellers found new ways to dramatize the tension between fame and fact. Plays included scenes where a hero walks away from applause to sit in a kitchen and be bored, and audiences wept in a new register. The Marvel zombies as a literary trope shifted from horror to tragedy, not simply beings to be feared, but warnings of a world that would rather remember an outline than a life. People began to see celebrity as a responsibility rather than a prize. And in this new ethical landscape, the last gate stood as a slow, immovable witness, an artifact of a larger moral correction. There is a last image that tends to settle in the mind of those who tell this tale, the last gate opening once more at the horizon of the world like an eyelid, soft as it is imposing, allowing through not an army but a procession of small things. Children carrying tokens, elders bearing folded letters, those who had once been ravenous bringing back the names of the people they had consumed. They did not march triumphantly, they walked carefully, as if carefulness itself were a kind of worship. And as the gate closed behind them, the sound was not finality but the settling of a hand on a book that had been reopened for cautious study. It is tempting to turn this into a parable about forgiveness and call it done, but the story is messier than a moralized ending. The last gate of Tartarus did not erase hunger from the world, and the Marvel zombies remain a haunting possibility whenever we shortcut the slow work of remembrance. The tale is meant to be a mirror. Look at how we treat each other's small truths and you will see what kind of world we are building. Tartarus changed because someone insisted on the ordinary, and that insistence is the true engine of long-term survival. So the final note is less triumphal and more practical. Care for the particular, and you may prevent monstrous appetites from forming in the dark. If you are driving or distracted as this story is told, imagine a tiny object in your hand, something you cherish not because it is valuable in the market but because it anchors you to a person or a place. It might be a ticket stub, a child's drawing, or a pressed leaf. That object is what the librarian carried into the last gate, and in carrying it she demonstrated the power of attention. Her act was not spectacular, but it was fundamental, a refusal to let the smallest things be eaten by an appetite for simplification. If you care for something that seems of little worth, you participate in the same quiet resistance the gate once enacted. The last gate remains in myth now as both a warning and a hope. It teaches that the balance between maintaining order and preserving mercy is delicate and must be tended. The Marvel zombies are a cautionary emblem of what happens when identity becomes prey. Tartarus's response is a blueprint for how change might be enacted without erasing consequence. Neither side wins in a single stroke, but the possibility of a world where attention outlasts hunger is worth stewarding. If you leave this story with anything, let it be the sense that small acts of remembrance matter in ways you cannot predict. Life in the aftermath is not tidy, and the story does not close neatly. There will always be new appetites, new forms of erasure, and new gates to confront them. But the last gate taught a generation how to run an experiment in which memory has teeth that are not meant to maim but to hold. It taught that the architecture of the underworld can be repurposed, that stone can learn nuance if given the chance. The Marvel zombies recede in some corners of the world and flare up in others. Sometimes the struggle is local, sometimes global. But the legacy remains. The world learned to value context, and that lesson is prophylactic in 1,000 small ways. So the last gate remains, a place where stone listens and where the small things are deposited like offerings. It waits for the next creature that will try to feast on names, for the next culture enamored of icons and forgetful of persons. And when that time comes, the gate will not act alone. It will require people who are willing to tell small truths and carry minor tokens into the dark. The librarian's work continues in 1,000 hands, in quiet rooms and market squares, wherever people insist on remembering. Tartarus will be there, not as an enemy of change but as its stern, watchful partner. It's not just the gate that endures, it's the people who still care to remember. Subscribe and share in the comments whether you feel closer to those who protect old truths or those who carry them forward.